It's my pleasure to welcome our third keynote speaker, Alta Sharo. She is the Warren P. Knowles Professor Emerita of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. At present, she works as a national and international consultant to industry and government on biotechnology, regulatory policy, and ethics, with an emphasis on emerging genetic therapies. She also serves in a number of advisory positions with the government and professional societies. At the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, she was recently appointed to the board of the Life Sciences and Biotechnology Program, while continuing to serve on the Standing Committee on Advances and National Security Implications of Transdisciplinary Biotechnology. Her most recent government advisory appointment was to chair the study on autonomous global biosurveillance for the horizon scanning work of the Biological Sciences and Technology Committee of the Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Her next assignment will be to serve in a study looking at augmented cognition. Sharo also sits on the board of directors for the Allen Institute, a basic science research institute dedicated to open science, and on the ethics and policy committees of the International Society for Stem Cell Research. Please join me in welcoming Alta Sharo.
Thank you. And thank you particularly for Jay having invited me, even after I told him that this is not a topic I usually speak on. I want to start by first just mentioning, as we often do in these settings, some of the conflict and bias. And you just heard that I'm on some of these committees at the Department of Defense. I still call it the Department of Defense, as opposed to the Department of War. I've also consulted with DARPA in the past under the Obama administration and the Biden administration, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid, on things having to do, in some cases, with neuroethics and other cases with epigenome editing. And I am currently a paid consultant to a variety of biotechnology and pharma companies, none of which I'll be discussing today, but some of the DARPA stuff may come up, and I wanted to let you know that. So I'm going to start by talking about something that's very, very close to my heart. My very, very, very close friend from childhood, Sherry, developed ALS. She was diagnosed at age 31, and by age 33, she had completely lost the ability to speak. By age 34, she was using a computer pad with a fingertip that could still slightly move so that she could move a cursor in order to point to various letters and spell out the messages, including one day that I still get choked up thinking about, when she moved out with her finger, "Go upstairs and brush your hair," to her 11-year-old daughter. By the time she was 35, she was limited to blinking, so we would recite the alphabet and then she would blink at the letter we got to. This made communication extremely slow and difficult. And by age of 36, she could no longer blink, but she could sort of move her eyes left and right. And as she began to lose that and enter into completely locked in, a decision was made to discontinue any further life-saving efforts and only continue what was already in place. And quickly after that, she passed away. Now, that was in the 1990s. So today, she might have been the beneficiary of some of these things you've been hearing about, brain-computer interfaces. Would it have been a therapy or an enhancement? It would certainly have been an assistive device. It would have circumvented the limitations of her body. But a direct brain-to-computer interface is certainly something that is not within current human capacity without this technological assistance. And would it have mattered if we had initiated this earlier on, when she still could have communicated by voice, but we thought, why not get her started, because you can learn how to use it. These things take a lot of training. Would it have mattered if it had been used before she got the diagnosis, but when we knew that she was doomed to have this diagnosis? That, by the way, was not the case. It appears to have been a spontaneous case of ALS, not one of the more rare genetic causes, but still. If we could have predicted she was going to face this difficult path, what if we had started this on her when she still was fully competent and fully abled? I think that Cody has already set us up very nicely on the kind of subtleties of the distinctions between therapy and enhancement, as well as for a conversation about why it is that as soon as somebody says enhancement, There is among many an intuition that somehow enhancement is bad and wrong, whereas therapy is good and okay, right? And I think what we've heard already from him and what I'm going to be talking about as well is that the distinction not only is blurry, but is not necessarily a distinction that in and of itself tells us whether something is good or bad, or should be promoted or discouraged. Really, in many ways, what we're talking about at this meeting and talking about in the work that you all are doing in your other contexts is whether technology can improve all of us and of humanity without somehow undermining what it is that we think of as being essential to humanity. One of the things I'm not going to talk about today in this talk that's really about enhancement more generally is change for the sake of change. You know, the way in which, I dyed my hair because I don't really like the way I look with gray. Okay, I mean, yes, arguably there's some economic benefit to not looking older, but really more than anything else, it's a change just for the sake of personal gratification. Personally, as somebody who's very big on biotech, I would love to be able to have something in the biotech world that I could rub on my skin and give myself plaid skin for the day, just for fun, right? Which, by the way, I think is entirely possible in the future. But that's not what I'm going to talk about as well. What I'm going to talk about are the kinds of things that have been the subject of historical aspirations, whether it's eternal life in the Gilgamesh sagas, or Icarus and his flight and the ability to soar, alchemy trying to transform things and ourselves, and then, of course, in a more mundane fashion, any library or bookstore seems to have endless shelves on self-improvement, whether it's exercise or it's diet or it's meditation, or it's crystals, but we have historically always looked to somehow transform and enhance ourselves. People who know me know that I was, for many years, a Star Trek fanatic. I'm delighted that yesterday somebody talked about the Borg. But there are many examples in Star Trek of species that have so-called enhanced capacities. We have the Ferengi with their larger ears and enhanced auditory capacities. I heard that somebody talked about Geordi and his visor that lets him see into the infrared and ultraviolet. At the bottom left, we have from Star Trek Insurrection, the people who were able to live very exaggerated long lives. The ones on the left were the ones who stayed on the planet with the mystery substance so that they could be forever young. The ones on the right are the ones who left the planet and used some very bizarre skin-stretching technique to try and achieve the same purposes. We have the genetically engineered Dr. Bashir, who was almost drummed out of the service because you weren't allowed to be enhanced with genetics. And yet at the same time, nobody objected to Spock being able to do mind melds, today's equivalent. In the middle is a species you probably have never heard of, but this is one that had enhanced olfactory capacities. So that's interesting. I lost all the text at the bottom of that. That was simply to say that we've got a lot of technologies now that are converging, AI and neurotechnologies, as well as nanotechnology and biotechnology, that are now coming together and converging in a way that offers us new opportunities to enhance ourselves in ways that we couldn't think about before. And it's across many different domains, cognitive and physical. We've got here Dr. Hughes talking on YouTube about moral enhancement technologies, as well as sensory and strength, and of course on the bottom right, the idea that is getting more and more play and more Silicon Bros building companies around the idea of life extension. In almost every one of these conversations, there's an effort to distinguish between therapy and enhancement, where therapy is either treating or preventing disease, bringing a patient up to what we call species-typical norms. Norm Daniels was an early writer in that field, and where the intent is really to eliminate or avoid harms. Where enhancement is put into a category of things that somehow augment or add entirely new kinds of traits that go beyond anything that has been considered species-typical or normal, and are aimed really at people who are already healthy or healthy enough, right? But it has created conundrums, and again, Cody's already introduced us to us, right? So, like many people here, I use corrective lenses. But on top of that, I had cataract surgery. Now, my cataract surgery that I had replaced my old lenses, which had imperfect eyesight, with better eyesight than I ever had before in my life. I still need this for various reasons. But Was that an enhancement because it didn't bring me back to what I had been? Now, what I had been was imperfect, but it wasn't somehow a major deviation from species typical. In fact, it was a very species typical level of imperfection. But by putting me back to a level of species typical perfection, was that an augmentation, was that an enhancement, or was that a therapy? And then when I add these corrective lenses on top, again, we have these same questions. So even in this kind of therapy enhancement distinction, we are constantly asking ourselves, are we supposed to somehow be putting ourselves back into some position that fate or God or nature placed us, or is it okay for us to expand beyond that? Similarly, we have lots and lots of debates about the use of steroids and other enhancements in the context of athletics. Now, I think most of us recognize that elite athletes may be within the species capacity, but they are not species typical. There's nothing typical about the kind of people that can do the triple axels that our last speaker was talking about, right? This is something that is extraordinary. So if we were to use enhancements to bring somebody up to an Olympic level of capacity, is that an enhancement? Or is it acceptable because it is simply something that is already within species capacity? Does it matter if what you're doing is you're using this tool, whether it's drug or device, to take somebody who was disabled and move them up to this extraordinary level versus somebody who was already average and moving them up to this level? Because really, at the end of the day, they're both being moved up to Olympic level. These are the kinds of reasons why this distinction between therapy and enhancement, or our notions automatically of enhancement is somehow bad, really tend to fall apart. And yet, and here again, Cody, I really couldn't believe that you and I came up with exactly the same language. I had said, the fact that I cannot really define dusk and dawn doesn't mean that there aren't times I know whether it's day or night, right? So the fact that the distinction is blurry means that it may not be sufficient to answer all questions, but it doesn't mean the distinction is completely without use in some contexts. Now another, whoa, that's interesting, came out in white. Every once in a while, when you use technology, you have these surprises. I thought for sure that was supposed to be black. Anyway, another kind of, no, I'll just read through it, it's okay. I'm sure you can't quite make out what it says. Another distinction that people have made in this discussion has to do with whether things are natural or artificial. So if I'm naturally 6'7" and therefore I'm able to play in the NBA for basketball, that's okay. But if I were to take growth hormones to move me to 6'7", that would not be okay. So is it natural is okay and artificial is not? Is natural okay because it's God-given as opposed to artificial because it's human-created? And I'm going to come back at the end to this issue around our notions of God. But even the notion of natural is very problematic. And what you can't see here is reading a book. Is that natural? Certainly the book is not natural, but it seems to be natural in the sense that it's something we all do. So is natural just a very sloppy way of saying ordinary and very commonplace? Eating vegetables is an enhancement for our health. Doing homework or exercising. Well, exercising and eating vegetables maybe comes closer to what we think of as natural, unless, of course, you want to ask whether the vegetables were farmed versus foraged. But doing homework and reading a book are arguably artificial. Is natural God-given? So is living to age 300 a violation of nature or God's will? But today's lifespan is already about 3 times longer than it was in the distant past. So again, right, even if I haven't used a drug, even if I'm one of these people who's managed to live an entire life without using a drug or a device or ever seeing a doctor, does my longer lifespan somehow get discounted because it really is the beneficiary of many other things around me, whether it's environmental protections or it's the fact that other people are not carrying contagious diseases, at least until recently when vaccination policy changed. Another way that people have tried to make distinctions rather than natural versus artificial is tools versus transformations. We were just hearing this in the last talk about things that are implanted or integrated into our bodies versus external devices. So if it's external, it's only a tool, but when it's integrated, it becomes an enhancement. So when I use my laptop and I go and I look for things on Google, that's a tool, but if it were in my brain and I could query Google just by thinking about it, suddenly it becomes an enhancement. But at the end of the day, all we're doing both times is querying a search engine. So again, is there a reason to make a distinction? Sometimes maybe yes, because potentially, something that's integrated could be always on and always accessible, whereas a tool needs to be gathered and brought to you. Maybe because something that's implanted or integrated is not apparent to others, so maybe it's really not about the intrinsic qualities so much as it is about the degree to which other people know and perceive and can evaluate my capacities. Or is it this, and again, this is very relevant to the questions that were coming up just before about the sense of ownership and it being part of my personal identity. Somebody asked a question about a pacemaker and whether or not that essentially becomes part of your identity because you feel so dependent upon it and it's within you. Again, none of these seem to completely capture, and again, it may be that no one aspect of these distinctions is sufficient, but collectively, looked at collectively, perhaps they give us a better sense of what it is that we think of as being therapeutic versus enhancement, that sets us up at least for a conversation about not only what is an enhancement, but whether or not enhancements are acceptable and in what context. So of all the techniques, right, we can think about them basically in these categories where it's physical and biological, like steroids and prosthetics and exoskeletons, and more recently genome editing and epigenome editing, versus the cognitive ones that are more the subject of the discussion here today. I'm curious how people feel about beta blockers. Beta blockers are often taken for the reduction of anxiety. I'm somebody who gets incredibly scared before I give a talk. I've been told many times I ought to take beta blockers. I haven't yet, so right now I'm like this, right? Beta blockers, if I took those, would that be an enhancement? If all it did was make it possible to speak to you without going like this? What about radical life extension? This I mentioned, the Silicon Bros, there are now 3 or 4 different companies that have really entered this field. The pursuit of a dramatically increased maximum human lifespan, and what they often talk about is health span. That is a period of time in which you are substantially healthy. By repairing cellular damage, by replacing organs. There are the true science fiction people talking about growing replacement bodies. But basically where the goal is shifting from curing individual diseases to trying to slow the biological aging process itself. It's an eternal quest. So all the way back to Gilgamesh, as I mentioned earlier, is there anything more natural than wanting to live longer? Is it really an enhancement if we live longer, or is it really just another version of nature? And yet, it's also something that helps us to appreciate some of the more fundamental dilemmas in this area of enhancement, and it really is about social disruption and notions of fairness. In Robert Heinlein's book, Methuselah's Children, there is a subset of the population that has a naturally longer lifespan by virtue of controlled breeding. A very wealthy philanthropist had paid people who had 4 very long-lived grandparents to marry one another and have children in the hope that this would, from a genetic standpoint, reinforce whatever trait it was that let their grandparents happen to live to very long age. And over a series of generations, it's a little unrealistic in terms of the timelines, they do develop into people who live extremely long lives with very good health. And those on Earth who don't have this benefit in terms of their genetic backgrounds eventually get wind of this and are convinced that there's some secret therapy these people are using, not that it was a natural kind of eugenics project. And the social disruption that's created by this competition and fear and envy leads to the entire novel, which is about the off-planetary adventures of the long-lived people who just fled. Ironically, promoting innovation on the part of the short-lived people who remained, or not really short-lived. I mean, to take the point that you made again, Cody, their lives hadn't been made any shorter than they were. They were ordinary lives, right? But that suddenly felt short by comparison. Who then innovated and created a blood replacement therapy that it looks a lot like stem cell therapy today. But it raised these kinds of questions about justice, right? Who gets these enhancements, however we define them? If they are advantageous in any way, who gets them? And does it create some kind of biological divide? Second, in the context of age extension, and particularly this concern about stasis and generational turnover, that is, if we have longer lives, does it mean that we now have a body of people who are senior and are occupying positions of authority in a way that will squelch innovation and movement on the part of people who are younger? And arguably, we've seen in our own politics domestically some of these very arguments about senior people. And I remember at a faculty meeting once, one of my younger faculty actually saying to one of the older faculty, "When are you going to get out of our way?" Yeah, faculty meetings are a lot of fun. There are people who worry about resource and environmental strain if there were a precipitous drop in the death rate. I should have to say, though, that those people who worry about these things fail to correct for the fact that we also really need to be looking at demographic distributions. And so really the issue is whether or not you have enough young people to support all of these older people. But the real thing that goes on in these debates around extension of life is about this meaning of life and whether the idea of mortality gives us a sense of urgency that itself is somehow intrinsic to the human experience, and that without that sense of urgency, that we would somehow devolve into passivity or complacency, and in some way lose that edge of excitement and passion and ambition that is a hallmark of our existence. I think all of these conversations lead to the question not is whether enhancement is bad per se or whether it's only bad to the extent that it creates a bad consequence. So in the Winter Games, I think it was the last Olympic Winter Games, there was something called Crotchgate, in which there was a controversy around the uniforms that were being used by the Norwegian team. It turned out that just a few extra stitches in the crotch of that suit could have enough of an effect on the aerodynamics that it would give the ski jumpers just a tiny advantage. But because often people are winning these things by centimeters, that was enough. And so the Norwegian team was, actually it was their trainers, their coaches that were fined for having used this illegal suit. But you know, we have the same thing again with swimsuits and sneakers and all of these various sporting competitions where there's a constant effort to figure out how do we level the playing field, right? So here the issue is not the enhancement per se. There's nothing intrinsically wrong about a suit that makes you go farther, or sneakers that have more bounce, or swimsuits that give you better movement through the water. It's only in the context of when you're trying to level the playing field for the competition. But again, why are we leveling it with regard to the equipment? We've never leveled it with regard to the bodies. We do it in a gross way with male-female, although even there we're now, of course, struggling with that distinction because men and women exist along bell curves. But I'm only 5'1". There's never been a short person's basketball team, right? So we've never leveled the playing field there. We've accepted the idea that there's some intrinsic inequalities, and we will only test people who are at the far end of that. In boxing, on the other hand, we do make these distinctions. We have featherweights and lightweights and middleweights and heavyweights. So we are confused all the time about where it is that we think that fairness requires some kind of radical equality and where it is that we accept these differences and only test within certain distances. It's the radical equality. That's the scenario in which enhancements become particularly problematic. Kurt Vonnegut wrote this story, Harrison Bergeron, about a world in which there's radical equality, and so talented ballet dancers had to wear weights on their ankles. A particularly smart mathematician had to wear something that would constantly ding against his head to disrupt his thought processes. It was Kurt Vonnegut's very unrealistic diatribe against the idea of equality or socialism or some version of that in society, and in which his complaint was that we were trying to move everybody down to an average as opposed to celebrating the different levels of capacity. So With Kurt Vonnegut and with the Norwegian team and with all these other people, I would simply ask, when and how should enhancement technologies be limited? First, does autonomy and freedom limit government regulation or prohibition on enhancement technologies that we might want to use? In the medical context, are the usual risk-benefit analyses sufficient? And in the non-medical consumer context, which we just heard about, do any sufficient regulatory mechanisms exist for whatever purposes we want to achieve? In the medical context, we have a very traditional kind of risk-benefit equation that's used domestically by the FDA. It has intrinsic limitations. There's a very subjective nature to benefit, whether it comes to evaluating the benefit of being able to circumvent your infertility. What's the benefit of having a child? It's emotional. It's arguably financially to your detriment, at least until you're much, much older. But it's a benefit assessment that has a lot of subjective qualities to it. Others as well. Freedom from pain is very, very subjective. I sat in when I was at the FDA. I've rotated in and out of government over my career, and I was at the FDA for a while during the Obama administration and sat in on conversations about the benefit of asthma relief that lets a child sleep better through the night, and how to balance that against the 1 in a gazillion chance that it might actually kill the child. This was a real problem with this drug, right? And at first it was, sleeping through the night so you're a little tired the next day, what's the big deal? Except you realize then that the child is going to do poorly in school. Doing poorly in school is going to track for the rest of your life, including bad health outcomes for the rest of your life. It was really fascinating exploration of how difficult it is to put, even in the medical context, some kind of objective metric on these things. In addition, even in the medical context, we have statutory limitations on what we're allowed to consider when it comes to risk and benefit. And one of them is that you cannot consider social inequities. So the fact that a drug or a device might work and work well, but would only be available to some people and might create a Robert Heinlein level of envy and social disruption is not something the FDA is permitted to consider. That consideration is considered more political. It might be up to Congress or to a state legislature, provided it's within their constitutional authority, but it's not within the statutory authority of the FDA, which takes a very, very narrow look at things. When you get to the medical context, however, there are still some advantages despite these limitations. There's at least a national level regulatory authority that gives you some uniformity throughout the US. It has a structured mechanism for evaluating the safety and efficacy of devices and drugs through controlled trials. And it has independent assessment, both of the ethical issues associated with how we test it through the IRBs, as well as the agency's assessment prior to approval. And in many cases, although not all, there is a post-market follow-up period, whether it's more studies or it's mitigation measures or it's registries. So there are some advantages in the medical context that are present. It's still imperfect. Not only are the evaluations subjective, but we have real challenges when it comes to consent because in the case particularly of these implanted devices, we've already seen situations in which companies go out of business and people are left stranded, either with a device in place that needs to be removed or a device they want to keep, but there's nobody now to monitor and manage the device into the future. In addition, even in the medical context, there is a strong autonomy-based movement that's resisting the idea of government regulation. And we see it in the right to try movement. The right to try concept really took hold over the last 15, 20 years, and it finally became adopted by the FDA, but only in the context of life-threatening situations. What's really interesting is we're now seeing it expand in this more kind of libertarian moment that we're getting in some respects. Montana now has, at the state level, something that is in violation of federal law but has not been challenged by the federal government. And Montana now does not limit right to try, that is, access to unapproved drugs or devices that cannot be sold in the United States according to the FDA, but allows people access and allows physicians to prescribe them or provide them, even for patients who do not have life-threatening situations and who have options with standard approved therapies. So Montana basically is a Wild West free-for-all. The only thing that controls it is that the clinicians get licensed to provide these unlicensed and unapproved things. In the semi-medical context of enhancers, we have this phenomenon of the DIY biohackers. You may have seen some of them on YouTube. They tend to operate outside of medical institutions, and they range from lifestyle optimization, lots of health metric tracking, to more invasive things. So you see them inserting things in themselves or experimenting with substances over, it was not at the talk, but somebody at my table was mentioning something about peptides and this phenomenon now where people seem to be getting peptides. And the thing that's really interesting is that they're getting these unapproved drugs from companies that are selling them not as drugs. They're selling them as research only kinds of substances, not for drug use, trying to thread the needle over the definition of drug that is statutorily determined. And then the people who use them and go on YouTube constantly say, but I'm not marketing this. I'm not encouraging you to use it, so I'm taking no responsibility, and again, trying to evade the federal authority that says that you cannot market an unapproved substance that meets the definition of a drug or a device. But this is also part of this more kind of libertarian, autonomy-based movement that would also thread through cognitive enhancements or other kinds of BCIs or any kind of neurotechnologies. This argument that I can do what I want with myself. And in that non-medical context, if you don't at least have the authority of the FDA, which says that if it's a drug or a device, which has a very specific definition, then you cannot sell it in the US without having gone through a regulatory process. If you're not in that medical context, then you have very few limitations on what you can do. The Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Product Safety Commission have authority over a number of things, but they also are wildly under-resourced, and they tend to be very, very specific in what they decide to go after, which is why we have endless kinds of phony baloney weight loss and impotence and what was the third category? There's certain categories, by the way, that always come up even since the 19th century from snake oil salesmen. Weight loss, impotence, sleep, and there's one other that's going to come to mind, and I need the memory cognition enhancement right now. There's the perception that the non-medical stuff is somehow intrinsically lower risk, and that therefore it doesn't need controlled trials and doesn't get controlled trials, and there's usually a lack of any kind of required follow-up. So in this consumer market, you lack a lot of those protections that exist in the medical context, and it really does feed very much into this kind of autonomy-based libertarian argument. I can do whatever I want. Doesn't matter if it's an enhancement or not. It's up to me. And so in this, and I don't want to belabor this point because you've been hearing about it already, you have all kinds of non-medical / recreational kinds of neurotechnologies being developed, whether it's the direct-to-consumer wearables like the EEG headbands and the neuromodulation headsets, earbuds that are supposed to increase your focus or your sleep quality, then the transcranial direct current stimulation for healthy individuals to presumably boost their memory, as well as the consumer wearable devices. Other people here are going to talk more about this, so I won't dwell on it, but really, most of the time, the questions are, as we've already heard, first, in the consumer context, are we creating a situation of quote-unquote unfair advantage? Because we all know that there are some advantages we view as fair. And second, does it create an implicit coercion, a situational coercion to take advantage of these things? And then secondly, since they are commercial, and this again came up in the previous panel, a lot of the data is going to fall into gaps in our legal structures. So who owns the data and what can the data be used for? I do want to mention, by the way, concerning this business about commercial surveillance or surveillance capitalism, that in it must have been 1976, I was watching an episode of 60 Minutes, when 60 Minutes was still 60 Minutes. And they were showing an interview with somebody who simply looked at someone's checkbook, and they saw how much was paid for rent, because everybody paid by check then, right? How much was paid for rent, how much money was spent at the grocery store, how much money was spent at the liquor store, how much money was spent at a clothing store. They looked at basically the pattern of expenditures in the checkbook. really credit cards were not used nearly as widely, so the checkbooks were really a great insight into people's financial situation. It was extraordinary how much could be inferred about the person, about the family situation, about their health situation, about their preferences. And although they didn't do it then, I think today they might have been able to tell somebody's sexual orientation if they were writing checks to certain places that people go, or subscriber services. They could tell a lot of things. So this is, again, not a new phenomenon. It's only that we've increased the amount of data and thereby increased the ability to infer more and more from it. All of this, putting that part aside, all of this about the kind of do-it-yourself and right to life, right to try movement is really begging this underlying question about enhancements and autonomy. That is, if it harms no one other than oneself, can the government prohibit it based on safety concerns or regulate it based on safety concerns, right? We accept that we don't live in a completely libertarian kind of universe in the US, that we have a regulated market. Usually, though, we regulate products that might harm only the user based on the idea that there is some intrinsic level of danger to the product and that neither the user nor the marketplace can adequately assess that danger and communicate it in a way that lets a consumer make a choice. Thus, we regulate the safety of airplanes and automobiles because as an individual, there is absolutely no way that I, without that kind of help, would be able to assess the quality of a car. But when it comes to the cup here, regulation much lighter. There is some regulation to make sure that there's no toxic substance in that plastic, or at least we thought so before we got into the whole microplastic spheres. But otherwise, it's very, very limited, right? So we really do have this notion that autonomy is a priority so long as it can be exercised. And to be exercised, it requires a capacity for understanding, right? And the same would then be true for enhancement technologies. To the extent that I can understand the technology, its risks, and its potential benefits, and I'm the only person affected, it would argue for very little regulation at all. Whereas a technology that is sufficiently complex, and many of the implantables would fit in that category, complex because of the effect it might have on my body, the complex on the effect it might have on my ability to remain myself so that I then am still in a position to say yes or no, which is the transformational moment, or complex in the sense that it might pose risks of being hacked or otherwise manipulated, that would subject it to much more government control, right? But again, control for my benefit, not control because we think it's socially disruptive. Now, a more subtle question, and the one that really goes to this constant argument about fairness and autonomy, fairness and justice, is even if it doesn't harm others physically, but if it harms the social order, if it disrupts the social order, is that sufficient for a government to prohibit it? So is our fear of the haves versus the have-nots, of the bioenhanced versus the unbioenhanced, the biological caste system, is that sufficient to justify a prohibition or some strict regulation on the development and use of these enhancements? There is a long history of government regulation in the United States based upon preserving the social order, and a long history of our constantly changing attitude about the acceptability of that. In our earliest colonial era, before we had the Bill of Rights, it was very common for state governments to legislate all kinds of personal behaviors, and nobody questioned that you could criminalize adultery, criminalize interracial marriage, right? Over time, our notions about the appropriate role of government vis-a-vis personal morality changed with the Supreme Court decisions about interracial marriage in Virginia, wonderfully named Loving versus Virginia, a very good example, but so was the Bowers versus Hardwick decision in Texas, which overruled a criminal statute that criminalized sodomy. And yet, at the same time, we're beginning to see a bit of a return under the current Supreme Court's understanding about a tolerance for government regulation in the name of public morality. And I think some of the debates we're now seeing around gender transformation, is linked to this notion about social order and the disruption of social order, in this case, the understanding of the roles of biological sex. And we are still debating laws about restriction over things like prostitution and homosexuality, prostitution and adultery and such. So here, I think that we really don't have an answer at a governance level about the role of government here, because we haven't yet come to terms with how much we think it's appropriate for the government as an engine for public opinion, more or less, because we live in a democratic society, but we know that it's not a perfect populist society, to try and structure the moral order or to structure our notions of fairness or equality, right? And that social disruption from the enhancements could be quite substantial. So this is a question we really need to grapple with, which is the role of government in this area. Whether it's sports or education or jobs that could be somehow distorted by an enhancement divide. That is not to say that this is, in fact, a good reason to limit these enhancements. We have seen all kinds of social transformation because of technological innovations, whether it's the introduction of electricity that put out a lot of home kinds of businesses, the use of computers, which has, I grew up where offices had stenos and secretaries, and by the time I became a professional, there were very few of those people, and by the time I ended my career, nobody had that kind of thing. You did everything yourself because you had technology to do it for you. The word processor had replaced not only the secretary, but had replaced a lot of middle managers through the internet. And AI is now going to be replacing even more of those. And for fair disclosure, I used AI when I was doing the research for this presentation and when I was putting together the slide sets. And I said, give me an outline. It was great. So I didn't have to have a research assistant who was going to go and look up the citations for me and was going to do the initial video graphic stuff. I want to diverge for a moment to one special area of enhancements that I think poses challenges that are a little bit different, and I know that the next panel is going to go into this in some depth, and I'm very grateful for that. And that is military enhancements. Because we have a very special situation with the military. You've got a very special situation with regard to necessity arguments in favor of using enhancements. You also have a very special situation in terms of coercion because of the lack of freedom on the part of warfighters. Now, we've been using enhancements for warfighters for a very long time. We have pharmacological augmentation already, whether it's targeted therapeutics and performance-enhancing drugs to keep people awake longer, keep them more functional longer, help them with altitude sickness. There are some that are more science fiction-y sounding, like red blood packing in order to help people with oxygen more efficiently, or to coagulate wounds more efficiently. There's a program right now, I'm not talking about anything classified, there's a program now looking at implantables that would be able to release therapeutics on demand. So it would actually incorporate the precursors to therapeutics, and then in the face of a particular kind of toxin or kind of insult to the body, you could then release the right combination of precursors, and it would actually manufacture in the body the therapeutic that's needed to counteract, right? There are epigenetic efforts to program people's bodies so that they are temporarily genetically altered. This epigenetics does not alter the actual gene, it alters the histones that surround the gene, and would allow not only a defense against various kinds of toxins, so it's equivalent to kind of a vaccine, but would also, in theory, allow for tracking, amazingly, what you were exposed to, so that it might help to lead back to a nefarious actor. So a kind of combination of defensive therapeutic medicine, like a vaccine, and now an offensive weapon because it's allowing you to track. The neurotechnologies for monitoring real-time neural activity, so we were already hearing about pilots and fatigue monitoring, potentially to allow for a more efficient interface with unmanned kinds of drones, and the drones are now a very, very big factor in war, and we're seeing that particularly in the Ukraine. And then, of course, futuristically, the NASA people are already thinking, what do we need for people to handle long-duration space exploration? The biggest obstacle to long-duration space exploration is radiation. There is no spaceship we can build at this point that can protect astronauts from the radiation. So radiation hardening of the body would be crucial if you want to have people survive the trip to Mars, let alone be able to manage on the surface of Mars. Right now, the only way to live on Mars would be to live underground in order to use the planet to protect you from the radiation, but you would still get sick on the way there. So NASA has been looking not only at genetic screening to screen out people from ordinary astronaut duties that might have more vulnerabilities, right? Something that, by the way, has been an issue with gender because women tend to have a different muscle to fat ratio, and that affects their vulnerability to radiation. But in the future, for long duration, we might actually want to enhance people in order to give them the ability to resist the kinds of dangers that are unique to space. And this has become the topic of a lot of discussion within the military. So you've got ideas, you've got pieces like this, which came out not very long ago on the intersectionality of bioengineering and identity and neurotechnologically enhanced military personnel. So for the warfighter, special concerns in the military context, very limited autonomy, alteration of capacities that might lead to a moral injury and reintegration to civilian life, and then when they do get back to civilian life, the creation of potentially a different caste. Looking at more closely, the bioenhancement in the military context is going to be used to alter already healthy bodies. In many ways, this is partly that therapy versus enhancement divide. Not completely, because vaccines also alter a perfectly healthy body, but it comes closer to enhancement. And so to the extent that there are risks and side effects, they are risks and side effects that are being experienced by those who are healthy, not being experienced by people who have a need at the moment. The need is not the need of the warfighter so much as the need of the collective, the need of the troop, the need of the nation. The behavioral side effects that are still not completely understood in the cognitive area, with potentially spikes in aggression or apathy, altered risk perception, and the degree to which that might actually interfere with adherence to things like the rule of the laws of armed conflict. And then, of course, concerns that if somebody were captured, that this would make them more vulnerable. So if they are actually altered in some way, particularly with implants, could those then be turned against them, is a very, very big concern. There's also the illusion of informed consent in the context of the military. In many, not all, but many situations, members of the military are not allowed to refuse certain medical interventions. Or if they do refuse, they are likely to be shunted to a different path within the military that is going to have a permanent effect on their career possibilities. Both of these things can mean that they are not really feeling free to opt out. And to the extent that they are opting in, classified information often means that they can't really know what the heck they're opting into, because the technologies themselves are the subject of great secrecy. And then when it comes to reintegration, there's the question of de-enhancement. If somebody has had an enhancement, whether it's something that just keeps them from getting fatigued over time, or it's something that gives them the ability to resist certain kinds of exposures to toxins in the field, or the ability to coagulate and self-heal, what happens when that is removed, if it's removed? If it's not removed, have we created this biological divide that people have been talking about with the potential for social disruption and envy? If it is removed, what does it do to somebody to once having been stronger, better, et cetera, and suddenly not? And is that a kind of moral injury? And do they have any choice about whether or not this happens? And finally, and I found this the most intriguing thing, and something I actually hadn't known until I started preparing for this meeting, international legal treaties, of which there are many concerning the law of war, they don't explicitly mention biologically modified warfighters. So it's the traditional armed conflict laws that govern. Now, there have been some interesting debates. Would an enhanced warfighter be considered a weapon? Whether it's integrated or not, whether it's an implant or not, whether it's a biological versus a mechanical enhancement or not. Would this person now be, in and of him or herself, considered a weapon? Interestingly, under the international humanitarian law, people cannot be considered weapons. But so even if they are cybernetic or cyborg or have prosthetics, they remain human combatants. But I don't think this was ever really written with the kind of technology convergence that we're looking at now. And it's exactly why people are now beginning to wonder, have we gotten to the point where we've got the ability to turn people through these enhancements into weapons? And what does that do for them in terms of their own sense of self? And it leads me to the last topic I want to touch on, and that is the topic of human dignity and the notion of authenticity. Now, there have been many different national bioethics commissions over time, from the 1970s through to the 2000s, although we haven't had one under the first Trump, the Biden, or the second Trump administration. So the last one was from the Obama people. I served on the one for President Clinton. Now, the George W. Bush Bioethics Council, National Bioethics Commission, but they called themselves a council, wrote a number of really, really interesting, thoughtful reports. And one of them, Beyond Therapy, Biotechnology and the Pursuit of Happiness, really, really delved into this topic of enhancements at that time. They argued that to view the human body as a machine that can be upgraded, that was how they viewed enhancements, is an intrinsic threat to human dignity. It undermines something like a natural life cycle, and that it is a rejection of what they call giftedness. It's a rejection of this idea that we have been gifted with certain kinds of capacities and should be grateful for them, that the effort to improve upon them is an expression of ingratitude, and that ingratitude is inconsistent with human dignity. That in addition, things that help us to avoid the struggle undermine the value of what it is we achieve. That is, that what we gain is valued in part by how hard it was to get to it. And so they argued for a wide variety of forms of resistance to enhancements. Now, a lot of this came up in the context of cloning and stem cells and embryo research. So in some ways, I think it was somewhat distorted by the political moment that they were in. But it was an argument that actually resonates with a lot of people who look at this through a more kind of theological lens. There were a variety of responses, some of which were really rude. I mean, Steven Pinker at Harvard simply called the report stupid. I think we should go beyond that. But Ruth Macklin, a philosopher, talked about how this idea of human dignity is simply too vague a term, and it tends to be a hide, intentionally or unintentionally, of a religious or political agenda. There were others who argued that because it's vague, we really should go and look at somewhat more measurable, somewhat more manageable concepts like autonomy and beneficence. That is, we should value things that increase human freedom to the extent that they actually make life better for either the person or for others. There were some who argued about the very sense of human nature, arguing that it is not some kind of fixed or sacred masterpiece, it's a work in progress. They pointed out the many biological flaws. I think everyone among us here can probably look at their own bodies and testify to those flaws. And that, in addition, some went even further and said not only is it not somehow wrong to take advantage of enhancements, but that we might actually have an affirmative obligation to take advantage of enhancements. They would ask, is there actually a duty to enhance ourselves for our own benefit or for society? And I am not a philosopher, so at great risk, I'm going to mention some of the things that the actual philosophers mentioned. That this imperfect duty that Kant had talked about to pursue natural and moral perfection means that we do have some obligation to try and make sure our talents and capacities don't rust away, even if it's not an absolute and infinite duty to do everything at every moment. That the consequentialists would argue that there's a moral imperative if we can increase overall well-being, not only for ourselves, but for others. So if you could help society by boosting your cognitive abilities, that you ought to. That failing to do so is missing an opportunity to help. That the people who followed the more Aristotelian virtue ethics talk about self-improvement as a path to flourishing, which a much more extensive concept of happiness that has to do with a generalized success and a well-being that goes beyond my ability to describe, because again, I'm not a philosopher. And I was interested to hear one paper that I was looking at talk about the vitalist ethics that some African indigenous populations have developed, in which there's a kind of duty to enhance creativity, health, courage, and self-reliance. So that there's a kind of duty to your own inner power. But basically, some of these DIY bioenhancers would argue that there's actually a duty to take advantage of everything that we can, to help others as well as to help ourselves. So far from being able to restrict it, because in the name of societal fairness, society's needs suggest that we need to promote as much excellence of various types as we possibly can. It leads to this idea about playing God. There are many who have argued that somehow we are subject to natural limitations that have been laid down for us by a deity, and that we need to accept that. Thank you, Michael. That we need to accept that. There are others who've taken a completely opposite view. And I was always struck by this book, Mendel's Dwarf. For those of you that have not read it, it involves somebody who's a chondroclastic dwarf. So he's going to pass on that trait to half of his children. He's having a child with somebody who's of average height. And Benedict Lambert is the dwarf. He's sitting in his laboratory playing God. He has 8 embryos in 8 little tubes. 4 of the embryos are proto-Benedicts, proto-dwarfs. The other 4 are, for the want of a better word, normal. How should he choose? In the way that word playing God is thrown around in the United States, it imagines a deity that actually is taking control of actions. And when we control them, that we are somehow violating the purview of that deity. And in this book, Benedict Lambert's insight is that, in fact, God rolls the dice. God plays statistics. God says 50% will be this and 50% will be that. And that far from playing God, to actually choose which 4 embryos is to play human. It's a complete inversion of the notion of playing God, and one that I've always found super valuable, not because I think it's right and that the other one's wrong, but so much as it upsets us, it upsets the normal use of that phrase, playing God, and makes us back away from it, because it makes us realize that not everybody has the same view about our obligation to yield to fate, however one defines it. So let me conclude simply with personal reflections. I think context is everything. I don't think enhancements are necessarily good or bad. I think they're good or bad in context. I think if you're playing a sport or going to a school where the idea is that you want to have an absolutely level playing field, then define what constitutes a level playing field and then test people there. You want to test them on their training or their grit or their determination, level the playing field and make that the only relevant variable. In other contexts, I think the enhancements don't actually pose a problem at all. There's nothing unfair about the fact that some people are smarter and other people are more creative and other people are more artistic and other people have better hearing. And in fact, personally, I kind of celebrate this diversity of things. And I have yet to write it, but I've been working on a short story for a while that involves a society in which at a certain point in life, everybody has a day where they choose the one enhancement they can get. And there are all different kinds. Some people might decide they want to be able to fly. Other people might want to live underwater. Other people might want to be able to hear other people's thoughts. But it's a very big decision day. But in the end, you have a society with people with all these interesting capacities, but they don't all have the same capacities, right? I also, by the way, have not been comfortable with the idea that we need to suffer in order to make things valuable, because I think most of us have agreed or have come to recognize that no matter how many things you actually simplify or make easy, there will always be something that comes along that will be the new challenge. So I've never worried that we're going to run out of challenges to make life valuable. As far as governance is concerned, I do think fairness is an issue in terms of access. To the extent that longer life or healthier life or better memory or any of these other things that are kind of universally valued become more accessible and more attainable through technological innovation, I do think fairness is a fundamental problem. And I think the answer to it is not the Kurt Vonnegut answer of making sure that we deny it to everybody so that we are all lowered to the same level, but instead I think it's that we need to make sure that it is made as accessible as possible to the widest number of people. To that extent, one of the reports I'm happiest to have worked on with the National Academies is this one from a couple of years ago on trying to develop ways to incorporate concerns about equity from the earliest stages of research and development, so that as the technology is developed, it's already being developed with an eye to how to make it financially or logistically or technically deliverable to a wider population. And that is the answer to the fairness problem with technological innovation, not to squelch the technology, but to figure out how to make it more widely available. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention for such a long lecture, and to note that this is only part of the credits that are due to the people who wrote much more extensively on this topic than I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sharo. Questions? Okay, I'll keep your hands up, please, just so I can get.
I just wanted to have you clarify a little bit. I think one of the issues for me is that medicalization can expand access for people. So, for instance, with cannabis therapy, before cannabis was legal, we were trying to have medical cannabis, but then we ran into the limitation that you have to prove the medical benefit of the cannabis, and that doesn't actually address the recreational use. And similarly with gender therapy now, I think people are beginning to say, well, the medicalization of gender dysphoria may not fit with our contemporary attitudes about this just being a matter of personal choice, and I don't actually have to be experiencing gender dysphoria. So in the sense of whether we push access to these technologies through the FDA, one of the things that you said was that the FDA is really about safety and efficacy, as opposed to some of these broader concerns. And so once we have that kind of libertarian, well, you can use it. It's not libertarian. We tested it. It's clinically trialed, but it's in society now, so you can use it. Versus your observation that there were a lack of social concerns included in the regulatory pathway, which would have a more restrictive context. So I just wondered, how do you think about this issue of should medicalization be the pathway for some of these things? And the regulatory pathway may not be also appropriate for the inclusion of equity concerns, because equity concerns should really come with how broadly we make it subsidized in society.
Yeah. Well, you're right that in some cases medicalization can help because it makes things eligible for insurance coverage, but it's very much it's a problem really of the insurance coverage more than it is the medicalization, right? And just medicalizing doesn't necessarily answer the problem, because insurance companies, as private entities in the United States or as public sources, whether it's Medicare here or it's the European systems, make choices about what they're going to cover. And they make choices based upon the perception that this is a benefit that's important to have and is affordable to the society as a whole, since those costs tend to be spread through premiums or tax subsidies. But it does have some potential. But non-medical devices can also be the subject of subsidies. It doesn't have to be medicalized to get that kind of subsidization. So somebody here earlier said something about smartphones now becoming a necessity of daily life. More looked at a deeper level, it's really about internet access as much as smartphones. And we've recognized the so-called digital divide, and the answer to that had nothing to do with medicalization. It was about a decision to subsidize rural access to internet, similar to how we decided to subsidize rural access to electricity in the early part of the 20th century with the Rural Electrification Project. So I think in both cases, we are talking about whether or not, as a society, we decide something is important enough that no one should be completely denied the opportunity. It still doesn't mean that everybody gets an equal opportunity. It may still vary in costs. It may be harder for some than others, but that there should be some minimal access. But it takes a lot of political will to do that. In the medical context, sometimes it has a lot to do with the political organization of patient groups, right, who actively lobby to get a particular thing covered, right? And the rare disease groups are struggling in that context. Right now, I think we're going to be seeing some of the same kinds of debates reactivated when it comes to things like internet service, because the current administration is decreasing the subsidizations in that area, and yet we know that that is absolutely essential if you want to now deliver services and education to remote parts of the country. So I agree in part that subsidization is crucial. I'm not sure that medicalization is always the best way to get there.
I was curious on people undergoing performance enhancement in sports, and that performance enhancement being also a medical enhancement. So sort of an example that I think illustrates this well is esports. So esports are sort of like video game sports competition, and they operate very similar to other like sports league. And there was an issue that happened a few years ago where some players were using Adderall as a performance enhancement to do better in these video games, and it caused a lot of questions about regulation. But Adderall is also a medicine that some people with ADHD really need. So there's all these discussions about like, should we forbid Adderall entirely? Should we allow for people with ADHD to use Adderall? So I was curious what you think of this particular context.
I think it really goes back over and over to what it is that you want to celebrate in that sport. So if what you want to celebrate is somebody's training, the effort that they put in to train themselves and become expert in something, then you're going to want to permit all the things that allow people to, whether medically or otherwise, move their bodies into what Norm Daniels would call species-typical functioning. And I completely bracket the problem of what is species-typical. You could even call average functioning. And then you've leveled that to the point now where the only real variable in play is how hard they're working to become expert, right? So I don't think it's whether or not it's Ritalin or whether or not it's medical. I think it's how do you get to the point where you've identified the variable that you want to test and celebrate, and how do you then get rid of control for all the others, right? We had debates years ago about human growth hormone. It used to be that it was very, very expensive and difficult to get, and then biotechnology developed a way to synthesize it, so suddenly it's more available. Human growth hormone used to be given only to children who had a demonstrated lack of human growth hormone. So it was considered a medical corrective measure. Suddenly, when it became more available, there were kids who were short. They didn't have a lack of human growth hormone. It was unclear why they were short, but it turned out that if you give them extra human growth hormone, they'd add a few inches. And the debate was whether or not that should be permitted. Is that an enhancement because they were destined to be short, or is it okay because all you're doing is making them closer to average? None of it was actually going to make them super tall. What if you took somebody who's already average and wanted to make them even taller, right? And this was exactly the debate, right? And in the end, I thought it didn't really matter whether somebody had a demonstrated deficit in human growth hormone. What mattered is whether we thought it was okay for parents to try to increase a child's height for whatever reason. Right? Assuming that there were no medical risks, and that was a big assumption, right? So that's a big, it was really, is it okay to make your kid taller? Right? There are a lot of advantages to being taller. I know this because I'm short, right? I've never been able to reach the top shelf of anything in my entire life. I really resent that. But it wasn't about whether it was medical. So I think, again, over and over, it would really help if we clarified what it is that we are interested in celebrating. And in sports, I think we've never really been all that clear, right? Because we think we're celebrating the training. I was watching the Red Sox-Yankees game last night while I was having supper. We think we're celebrating all the training that they do, and it's true, these guys work really, really hard. But some of them are just naturally more athletic than others. And so, should that be a disqualifier? Should we have made everybody have to be equally athletic before we then allowed them onto a team where they had to train and prove that they were working harder? We don't do that.
Fascinating talk. I wanted to kind of pick up on some of the language from the Bush President's Council about gratitude versus treating the human body as a machine or a commodity to be optimized. And kind of my first sort of flippant thought was, often I express gratitude for something by trying to cultivate it and kind of put a lot of effort into making it be the best it can be. And then I kind of found myself thinking, so the treatment enhancement distinction is about like whether you're coming up to a certain threshold or going beyond it. But maybe a lot of my intuitions are actually tracking the type of value scale that's being used and whether it feels like a homogenizing or a diversifying value scale. Because when I think about optimizing commodities, that really suggests that like everything is being ranked by one set of values, treated as a kind of fungible and exchangeable good on par with everything else. And you kind of worry that like everyone's going to end up, I don't know, the same height. Everyone is 6'7" after the human growth hormone is rolled out, versus value schemes that, I don't know, encourage a kind of embrace of diversity. So I guess, and I liked your suggestion right at the end about the short story where everyone gets some enhancement, but they all kind of get to pick different ones, because that feels like a nice way to embrace enhancement without it being homogenizing. And I guess I'm wondering what you think about that kind of homogenizing versus diversifying value schemes frame.
Well, first, please don't steal it because I haven't finished writing the story. That's my story that I'm trying to write. But obviously, you can tell from that I actually do think that the diversification is wonderful because there is no one thing that works in all settings. In fact, being really, really short might be super helpful for long duration space flight, right? And yet being very, very short might be very helpful for certain kinds of work underground, and yet being very tall is hugely helpful in other contexts. I think that we actually do understand and recognize that there is no one perfect type. We sometimes mistakenly believe that that's true or believe that others think that's true, and yet it turns out it's not. And let me take an example from something totally different. In one of the earlier iterations of my career when I was working for Congress for a science agency that doesn't exist anymore called the Office of Technology Assessment, I embarked on what I think to this day is the only congressionally financed tour of California sperm banks. And I had a chance to visit all of these places that were providing sperm for artificial insemination purposes, including the so-called Genius Sperm Bank. So I got really interested in this phenomenon of artificial insemination and whether or not, in fact, people optimized, right? And what was really interesting is that they did to some extent. So Cappy Rothman, who ran a sperm bank in Beverly Hills, no longer would accept donors who were 5'9" or under, which, by the way, disqualified both my brothers, because nobody wanted them. On the other hand, there was very little uptake for the so-called geniuses in the Genius Sperm Bank, who, by the way, were mostly just grad students and postdocs, not Nobel Prize winners. And when the Viking Sperm Bank opened up in New York, which was now going to sell tall, blonde, blue-eyed, which is always the stereotype for the United States of what everybody wants. Growing up in New York, of course, where everybody was dark-haired and dark-eyed, I never understood that, but okay, it's fine. They went out of business. They also didn't get takers. What it turned out people wanted, mostly, was somebody who looked like their partner, if they had a partner, because they wanted somebody who physically resembled the partner, whether it's to obscure the realities of the conception or out of sentimentality about the partner. And for those who didn't have partners, their preferences ran the gamut. There were some things that stood out. It was very interesting that Christians often would refuse Jewish donors, as if there was a little J on the genes. I thought, outbreeding is actually healthier. But, and then there were certainly racial preferences. Although, again, far better for people to mix it up in terms of both how much people are going to look great and also how you're going to outbreed and begin to reduce the possibility of reinforcing traits within your racial group, which tends to represent a previously reproductively isolated group. But mostly it was all over the map. I found it incredibly reassuring that people didn't have the kind of homogenized view of what is good or desirable or excellent in an area as personal and important as reproduction. So hopefully that tells us something about how they would treat other kinds of areas of choice as well.
Professor Charo, thank you for a really wonderful talk. Two questions or observations. So concerning the debate around the Beyond Therapy report, the Bush's Bioethics Council, I think that's a great example of how your view of enhancement would really turn on your view of the good life. and how each side to that debate tried to sort of conceal that relationship, right? So the liberal critics of the reports, you know, the assumption there that was never quite stated is that the only thing that's good is, you know, autonomy, self-customization, complete self-design, and under those circumstances, the whole giftedness argument doesn't make sense. And the sort of more conservative pushback was, well, or it relies on, but still concealed, the source of meaning is also in limitations, in making sense of limitations,
Yes.
in sort of learning to love what we inherit, and so on and so forth. You know, so rather than saying it's stupid, like Pinker said, which is a sad statement, it would be, I think, more rigorous to say, here are the sort of philosophical assumptions that, you know, inform my decision. And I'm assuming the same is broadly true about, broadly also true about how we interpret the scope, the permissible scope of enhancement in the first place. And then just quickly about your short story idea, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I also think it might be an opportunity to explore, like, what needs to be in place for there to be a diversity of ideas for enhancement, because it still might be that our imaginations are so limited and so influenced by the fashions of the moment that there would be like 6 kinds of enhancements that everybody would want, and that would be the distribution.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And what would be an enhancement is also very situational. That is, you know, in a world in which we still had stairs everywhere, an enhancement that lets you roll upstairs would be very valuable. In a world in which there are curb cuts everywhere and everything has ramps, suddenly that's not an enhancement with great value, right? So there's a lot to be said about the environment in which you're situated, right? On the Bush Bioethics Council and the idea of limitations, again, to draw from a different setting, but I think it might be instructive. When I was on the Clinton Bioethics Commission, it was the 90s, and you may recall that it was in 1998 that Gina Kolata of the New York Times broke the story about Dolly the cloned sheep, right? And it was set off this huge debate about cloning of human beings. If we cloned, who should we clone? It was a time of revealing the great depth of biological ignorance present in the United States because of the number of people who worried if we, you know, cloned Saddam Hussein, we were going to get a tyrant, as if you could clone personality. But they did want to clone Mother Teresa, except that there you'd probably just clone scoliosis. So, you know, but we had to write a report for the president. So we had these hearings, and we had one hearing at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. It was a great hearing. We had protesters coming in full sheep outfits, carrying signs going, "Cloning is bad," which was great. And we had representatives of various religious communities talking to us about theological approaches to the question of whether cloning is permissible. It was really interesting because we had some Protestant theologians, I think also a Catholic theologian as well, who had the same view, that really focused on the idea of limitations and the idea of grace through the acceptance of limitations. And that really ran through some of the theological viewpoints that they held. And then we had an imam who kind of went off completely on left field, saying, you know, first of all, for Muslims, humans are partners in creation with God. You don't have to accept creation as it is. We are partners in creation. And then went on to talk about genealogical bewilderment, because for him, that seemed to be the real problem with cloning, is the way it distorted the kinship relationships that we ordinarily understood. And then we had Moshe Tendler, Rabbi Moshe Tendler, who, as often is the case, interestingly, Judaism and Islam are actually closer to each other than Judaism is to Christianity in many ways. And also came in with this idea of kind of partner of creation, although there it was tikkun olam, the idea of repairing the world as an affirmative obligation. And he said it's just a much more active view about the role of humans. He goes, and he said it with this great, really old-fashioned Eastern European accent. So we're guests in God's house, and what does a good guest do? A guest gets up in the morning, doesn't wait for the host to make the coffee and make the breakfast. The guest gets up, goes in the kitchen, gets his own coffee, gets his own orange juice, but he doesn't move the sofa. So here was the question. And you look at the transcripts, you'll see we're a whole bunch of people on a bioethics commission reporting to the President of the United States debating whether cloning is making orange juice or moving the sofa, right? This is the nature of sophisticated conversation. But it really brought home to me that this idea about the role of limitations and how one overcomes them is a thread that runs through all of our theologies, but in very different ways, with very different instincts. And as I said at the very end, for me, and maybe this is because, in fact, I come from a Jewish background, I feel like there'll always be a limitation. No matter how many I get rid of, there'll always be another. So I don't feel like I have to accept the limitations that I have, because I'll thrash against them and then come up with another one. And so to the extent that you need them to find value, I'll find the value there. But I recognize that other people from other traditions have a very different set of instincts about this.
Just to ask about the playing God thing, because I think I understand the worry about playing God somewhat differently. And when you opened talking about Gilgamesh and so forth, I just think it's notable that all of those legends and things end badly. So it's like, and the point about playing God isn't so much about that you're crossing actional boundaries. It's much more that you're crossing epistemic boundaries and moral boundaries, because humans are very morally limited and we're not omniscient. So the worry about playing God is much more about when you're doing something that goes beyond human epistemic capacity and human moral capacity to handle. And I just wonder what you think about that, because I do think that's a fundamental underlying problem that you haven't quite addressed.
I think you're absolutely right about that, and I think it's a fair point and a nice nuance to put on this, because it circles back to the consequentialist discussion, right, about our inability to actually foresee and evaluate all the myriad consequences that will flow from our actions. And in a sense, that's the problem that you're identifying here, and that only an omniscient being can really appreciate why certain limits are needed in order to avoid certain consequences we can't even imagine, right? And yet at the same time, you look at some of the innovations we have had over the course of human evolution, starting with the ability to make fire. They are so profound. They have moved in so many directions that were beyond our imaginations, both good and bad, right? The same fire that allows us to cook our food so that it's safe to eat is the same fire that can take out half of the island of Maui. And also becomes the basis for all the discoveries that led to nuclear weapons. I find that these stories are not compelling to me personally, because they assume that somehow if the consequences are unimaginable and vast, that is a reason to not go there. For me, in some ways, that's exactly the reason to go there. But as a lawyer, I go there with governance. I go there with what Jay was calling Bayesian regulation, that is iterative regulation, constantly slowing, reviewing, allowing, and then allowing some but not all, and then going another step and another step in a very iterative process so that you exercise control over the innovation to the extent that you can, so that you can guide it, so that you can control it as much as possible. But for me, and again, it's personal, right? I value the serendipity more than I recognize the fear. But your point about the way the stories end is well taken.
Okay, let's thank Professor Sharo.
Thank you very much.